I'm Pallavi Ade. I'm the co-founder of Asian Pathfinders, along with Shreyas Deshmukh, and welcome to another edition of our Fireside Chats. Very interesting talk today, gender inclusive disaster management. We have Dr. Nivedita Haran and Lavanya Arvind as the speakers, and Aditya Valiathan Pillai as the moderator. Before I pass it on to Aditya, just a brief about us. Uh, we started last year in 2020 as a knowledge sharing platform where we try to bring scholars, practitioners, academics together for constructive dialogues on a variety of topics. And we still try to keep our forum informal. So we welcome comments, questions, and feedbacks from everyone. Please participate with your questions and comments in the chat section. Please stay on mute just because we record the session and put it on YouTube to reduce the noise. Also, what we do is through our fireside chats, which is held every Saturday at 11 to 12 p.m., and the dialogues, which are held as panel discussions every alternate Thursdays. So we just finished one this Thursday, which was on political journey of Indian women, and we had speakers from policy as well as politics speaking on this topic. A very, very passionate and a very, very interesting discussion. So, and obviously we put our sessions on YouTube, so you can always look at it if you missed it. So about our upcoming sessions, we have Professor Rohini Godbole, who's a physicist, and she is the last in our series, which we've done through the entire month of March and the first week of April on women-centric issues. So Professor Godbole will be speaking on gender neutrality in the pure sciences. The whole focus in the recent years also has been this aspect of why there are less women in science, the entire STEM studies. So I think that would be a very interesting discussion. For the ones who don't know, Professor Godbole is a very eminent physicist in this field. So, sorry. After that, we also have someone from the Swedish embassy speaking on what has been Sweden's experience of increasing the gender participation in politics. So that's going to be another interesting one. And obviously, we have Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon speaking on India's neighborhood first policy. That's on April 24th. And obviously, you can always keep an eye on our social media pages for the updates on the events that are happening. So yeah, and our website also will be online in a few weeks. So we'll also have the event details there. Also, community guidelines, like I said, obviously, please stay on mute. Also, respect the views of others. We are here to have constructive dialogues and discussions, so let's respect the purpose of the community and just the language that we use. Obviously, shares me, and you can always look us up online. So about today's session, I know Aditya is going to introduce Dr. Haran and Lavanya, but before that, introduce Aditya. Aditya is currently the Associate Fellow at the Initiative for Climate, Energy and Environment at the Center for Policy Research of Delhi. And Aditya's work has been around how states arrange their climate change institutions and the politics of regional electricity trade in South Asia. A long list of work that Aditya has done. You can always check out his publications on CPR website. So over to you, Aditya.
Thanks. Can you hear me, Pallavi?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. No, thank you. Firstly, I just want to start by congratulating both you and Shreyas for this amazing set of programs over the past month, but also over the entire pandemic period. I think it's definitely become a fixture of a lot of our Saturday mornings. And I like the fact that you've picked this issue to sort of not close out, but one of your final talks this month. Because climate, I think, as many of you know, has become more or less central to the public discourse and debate over the last few weeks, with an almost imminent announcement of India's net zero target, it seems like. I think it's coming maybe next month or a few months from now. And so that's the mitigation side of the equation, right? And it's important to also remember why we're doing these things and why we're thinking about net zero and why we're thinking about completely reorienting our entire economic system, all of government change and so on. And that's specifically because for a country like India, the impacts of climate change will be quite huge. Partially because we have a geography that is very vulnerable to climate impacts. So we have the Himalayas in the north. We have rivers flowing down from the Himalayas through extremely populous regions. We have a long coastline. We have arid regions, and we have cities that are prone to heat and flooding. So that in itself is enough reason to take climate change seriously, but also the fact that we have fairly low per capita income and our development indices are quite low, which means, amongst other things, we don't really have an established social security net. The implications of all of this is that groups of people will suffer from this worse than other groups of people. That's a very simple, but I think fairly concrete and well-evident statement in the sense that if you tend to live in areas that get government services and have a fairly high income, that's a great way to adapt to climate change. But if you don't have these things, then you're probably going to suffer in some way, shape, or form, right? And that's where the gender dimension comes in, and it extends thinking about differentiated vulnerabilities. And it's something that has long been discussed, at least in the academic literature, but has not seeped in to the policy discourse, and is not commonly part of the climate change discourse except in certain circles, right? And we've had various attempts over the last 5-10 years in Delhi, and definitely in some state capitals such as Bihar, etc., Kerala, where they've tried to sort of mainstream this, but it's not always had the effects that we wanted. So today we have this very exciting panel, and again, I want to thank Asian Pathfinders for putting us in touch with Dr. Nivedita Haran, who comes with tremendous government experience, and Dr. Lavanya Arvind, who brings deep academic expertise in the subject. So this panel is going to be structured in that tension between professional practice and academic insight. I'm going to introduce the two speakers, and they're both very accomplished, but I'll just try to give you the key points that make them people who should be talking about this issue and expanding our knowledge on it. Dr. Nivedita Haran retired as Additional Chief Secretary at the Department of Home Affairs in the Government of Kerala. And she's also served extensively in various other capacities in Kerala and the Government of India. Relevant to us, she spearheaded the setting up of the State Disaster Management Authority in Kerala and drafted and notified the Kerala Disaster Management Rules, as well as the Disaster Management Policy, the Disaster Management Plan, and the Standard Operating Procedure. And she's currently the honorary chairperson of the Board of Directors of the Center for Migration and Inclusive Development. She's occupied roles in the UN and played important roles in the policy spaces of Delhi and the National Capital Region. And she has a very wide range of domain expertise that spans environment protection, disaster management, climate change, and including the mitigation side, so energy efficiency and renewable energy. So that gives us essentially the entire gamut of climate change issues. Dr. Lavanya Arvind is at the Center for Disasters and Development at the Jamsetji Tata School of Disaster Studies at TIS, Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Her research interests are quite exciting in that she's picked areas of gender and development, gender and disaster settings, sustainability, vulnerabilities in the context of disaster, risk reduction, social exclusion protection, and gender and climate change. So extremely well suited to be complementing Dr. Haran's insights. More recently, she has just published a paper on gender and disaster settings in the United Nations Encyclopedia for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And she was awarded the Avabai Wadia and the Kursheji Wadia Fellowship for Archival Research by the Research Center for Women's Studies at the Women's University in Mumbai. So very quickly, I'll lay out how we're going to do this. Dr. Haran had a great suggestion yesterday that we'd actually try to emulate a chat. And we'd have 5-minute speaking interventions, first by Dr. Haran, then by Lavanya Arvind, back to Dr. Haran again, and then back to Dr. Arvind, and then we'll go to questions and answers. And so we'll probably have about 20 to 25 minutes for questions and answers. Can I suggest that the audience, and I know we have now a fairly nice number here, 33 people, so that's probably too many questions to just be doing this on the fly and have like a very intimate affair. So can I suggest that you put your questions in the chat? And if we have enough time for it, I may ask you to sort of turn on your video and audio and just ask the question, or if there's a lot of questions, I might ask them myself. Dr. Haran, Lavanya, can you start with an introduction to the space, and then we'll move to Dr. Haran for her grounded insights.
Thank you, Aditya, and thank you, Pallavi and Shreyas and to Asian Pathfinders for this initiative and for this topic today. I want to congratulate you on the topic choice. The more we have these conversations, we create a space for dialogue, and that hopefully turns into praxis. I'm delighted to share space and speak alongside such an esteemed and distinguished panelist and a disaster practitioner, Dr. Haran. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you. Aditya, you set the tone really well. You spoke about differentiated vulnerabilities, and that's where my sort of pitch is going to be. So people talk about disaster events as being great equalizers, but that's not true, as you had rightly pointed out, because everyday social practices and everyday anthropogenic activity on the environment, that's human activity on the environment, and the sort of extractive relationship that we have with the environment, and gender roles, and all of it are drivers of disaster risk, and particularly disaster mortality. And disaster mortality is a gendered dimension, and that's what we want to talk about. Of course, there are other vulnerabilities that come at play, but today we'll look at the gendered nature of it. So I want to first begin by speaking of providing some evidences from previous disaster events, both locally and globally, and to recognize the differential needs of all genders so as to do a robust disaster intervention. So for instance, if you were to look at the Indian Ocean tsunami, and as well as other flooding areas such as the Kosi floods in Bihar, and so on, it reveals that the number of persons who are affected the most, I mean by as part of disaster mortality, they are women. So a study by Oxfam post the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2005 revealed that 3 out of 4 disaster deaths in Tamil Nadu were because of were women, because of a simple reason. Women's chances of safety were reduced because important survival skills such as swimming were not known to them. This is owing to patriarchal impositions of modesty, dress codes, and so on that are detrimental to mobility. And this is one example of women not knowing how to swim. The second thing is, as I said, we have to talk about genders in the plural. So the same tsunami, if you look at the Aravanis, which is an indigenous transgender group in Tamil Nadu, who earn their living through begging and dancing, they were excluded from all social security schemes immediately, that were announced immediately after the tsunami. And it's the same for another group in Indonesia called the Warriors, also excluded from social security schemes because their names are not on the list and there is no documentation. So your pre-existing relations and your pre-existing hierarchies manifest in the post-disaster situation. Another example from Nepal, the 2015 Nepal earthquake, women comprised more than half of the affected population because they were indoors when the earthquake ravaged the mountain nation. again, the Bangladesh cyclone of 1991, the mortality rates of women were 5 times higher than men, because this was because they did not receive early warning signals in time. They did 91, no mobile phones or any kind of technological devices. Further, the warning information that was disseminated by the state was passed among and between all male groups in public spaces, so they didn't get enough warning time to sort of evacuate. And it's not only in the context of India, or other quote unquote poor nations, but other even the Western world, if you look at the experience from Hurricane Katrina that ravaged the city of New Orleans in the United States, African-American women were mostly affected. So intersections of race and class, and the Europe heat waves, the elderly women of France were the primary victims of the Europe heat wave. Nearly 70% of disaster mortality came from this group, and it was found that elderly women who lived without family support and who were dependent on welfare systems found themselves sort of severely affected. Now, from my own experience in the Belgavi floods, we could see that all the counseling support and psychosocial support were channelized towards women and not to men, because of all the patriarchal expectations of men being strong and so on, so that they have to be strong. So the differential needs of different genders have to be taken into account, and therefore pre-disaster kinship relations, social codes, religious, traditional, cultural diktats, the sort of social vulnerabilities, because there exist several critical linkages between gender inequalities, disaster risk, and vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities have to be recognized as multidimensional, because social, political participation, not being able to make decisions, gender just access to health, post-disaster healthcare, and gender-based discrimination that manifests in the form of restricted access to rescue or relief or compensation. I'll talk about the gender losses later, but all of this teaches us that, disaster interventions must integrate gender perspectives, practices, and we need to have that perspective. So I will stop there right now, yeah.
Brilliant, Lavanya. I think that just very hard empirical tone setting is just what we needed. So thank you for that. That was excellent. Dr. Haran, can we turn to you for your first set of remarks?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. First of all, I'm grateful that Asian Pathfinders has got me into this fireside, or is it a riverside chat? Where we are discussing some serious issues, and it is a forum to bridge the gap between academics and policymakers. I think we really need this, and that is something that I've been passionately working on these days whenever I get a chance. So I am grateful, and kudos to the Asian Pathfinders. Listening to me, I think some of you may feel that Lavanya and I have been discussing this over the last 2 days. Trust me, I'm seeing Lavanya for the first time, but a lot of things, Lavanya, you said, I'm probably going to mention them, but mention them in the context of a person who has worked in the field. And I think that should be interesting. So India is, let's say we are lucky, but we are also unlucky that we are at the receiving end of a lot of disasters. A lot of figures are quoted, and I think you all would have known it, and I will repeat a few of them. 59% of our land area is prone to floods. Almost 60% of our urban centers are prone to waterlogging, which is a very serious thing. This was not there earlier. 70% of our cultivable area is prone to drought, which again is something which was not there earlier, because as more and more area comes into cultivation, more and more they become more and more disaster prone. We've had some of the biggest disasters in history. If you look at it over the last 10 years, we had the Bhuj earthquake, we had the Kerala floods, we had the floods in Bihar, I think in 2019, and before that in I think 2000, was it in 12 or 11? We had the Kerala floods of 2018 when I was there. We had the huge Indian Ocean tsunami 2004 when I joined back there in 2005 from the UN, and so I was a part of the rebuilding exercise. We have these huge cyclones that our East Coast is prone to. We had Ayla, we had Amphan, then we had the one recently, Fani. So we are very disaster prone. There is no doubt about it. And then we have the creeping disasters. Our coastline, especially the western coastline, is constantly getting eroded. And we don't even recognize it. In the Government of India guidelines, the creeping disaster like coastal erosion is not even considered as a disaster as of now. So we do have these. Now, along with this, we have the other issue of a very dense and growing population. And therefore, the pressure on land, on water, on air is extremely high. And therefore, many of these natural disasters, which would probably have remained just simple hazards, have become converted into major disasters because of this, the pressure from the population. And the natural disasters and the anthropomorphic disasters have kind of merged into each other. And it's often very difficult to distinguish the two. Whether the floods in Kerala happened because of nature, because of the high precipitation, or was it because of the extensive destruction of the Western Ghats? That jury is still out, but I believe that a lot of interventions, human interventions, willy-nilly, without applying proper mind, and probably, let's not always blame the policymakers, a lot of it is also illegal, which happens in our country and many other countries, is because of that. Apart from that, we have the other anthropomorphic disasters like ROV collapse. We had that in Mumbai, if you remember, 2 years back, and many people died. We have the fires in public places. Last night, there was one in a hospital in Mumbai where 10 patients died. I think these are disasters that should not happen. It should not happen in a country like India, where we hope to be a superpower one day, very soon. Now, we know that, the usual formula that we often quote is risk is equal to hazard into vulnerability divided by capacity. So anyone who is more prone to disaster, living in an area where it's more disaster and is more vulnerable, is more prone to a risk from a disaster. Now, what is it that causes this vulnerability? And we know, and that's where what Lavanya said, I would like to reiterate, women face a higher brunt of the risk from disasters. And I'll give you a few examples, very simple examples. And this happens, let me also put it as an aside, that let's also remember that our policies are drafted by males. It's mostly men. There are states who still don't post women as revenue and disaster management secretaries, you see. So let's keep all these things in mind. So it is, I wouldn't say it is a willful discrimination by the men, but it's a lack of understanding. There are certain things that men would not even think, which you will realize when I give you my examples. When we were designing, the first of these are when we were designing the cyclone risk mitigation program in Kerala, one of the guidelines, the norm said that to decide on the size of the shelter, the disaster management shelter, the per capita area to be kept for each individual should be 3 square meters. Okay. Now imagine 3 square meters. You can barely sit on 3 square meters space. You cannot lie down, first. Secondly, for a woman who has moved from her home to a disaster shelter, to have somebody sitting elbow to elbow, and this 3 square meter is not for a few hours, it's for residing there. You see, shelters are places where people are kept on a temporary basis until their house is fit to be gone back to. And therefore 3 square meters, does it make sense? And I argued to such an extent that, I normally don't become annoyed, but I really got annoyed with the team that came from World Bank, etc., that 3 square meters, why it doesn't make sense, especially when it comes to women. You just cannot consider a woman to live for a week, 10 days in an area of 3 square meters. Their argument was, no, this is only when they have to stay in one place. Otherwise, they'll be moving around. I said, no, it doesn't make sense even for that. So that's a big issue, but I wanted to raise this, that how the sense of privacy is more important when you talk about women. It is so naturally, and therefore that has to be kept in mind. And that is something which even my colleagues in the government found it rather strange. Why is she arguing? Why is she making it such an issue? But it was an issue, and I will continue to make it an issue. The second one example I want to give is post-disaster, post-tsunami, when we were reconstructing. And I was visiting some areas in Kollam and Alapura. And one of the things that they said, and I don't know for those of you who do not know, although the major loss was on the Tamil Nadu coast, Kerala also lost almost 138 or 39 lives. I don't remember the correct figures now, but 100 plus lives. And I asked these women that why is it that I can understand the men died because they were fishermen inside the sea. Why have these 8 or 10 women died? And one of the things that a lady said, and I still remember that, she said, Madam, she was wearing a sari and she could not swim. And therefore she was caught up in the waves and she was pulled away. I said, my God, is that so? And do we not think about it when we talk about women going into the sea, the fisherwomen who are going in near the coast, and the tsunami waves came and hit her and she was drawn in because she got entangled in her sari. That is pathetic. So there is something in the dress code also, and Lavanya, I totally agree with you, and this is something maybe later sometime we'll talk about. So this is something which no man will ever think about it. And people continue to send us as donations saris. We didn't want them. The women said, no, we don't want to, and especially if you're going near the sea, we don't want to wear those saris any longer. Give us anything, give us suits, give us salwar kameez, we'll wear them. But don't give us saris at present. The third example I want to give is something that happened to me when I was in the UN, and I was serving in a conflict-ridden area called Kosovo. It's in Serbia, former Yugoslavia. And while we were preparing a baseline study for a project for construction of houses for the community there, one of the data that came to me very glaringly was that the number of girls who were dying of pulmonary diseases was exceedingly high, and especially amongst the Roma community. The Romas are the gypsies there, and they are the kind of the poorest and the most vulnerable in those areas. So I asked this question. I asked to the EU representative, I asked to the others, I asked to the leader who was there, why is it that so many Roma girls die before they reach the age of 15, 16? And after a lot of consultations and confabulations, what we realize, and I think I'm right on that, is that during the it's very harsh winter there. So during the 6 months of winter, these Roma girls, because they don't have adequate clothing, they stay shut up inside the rooms where the only fuel being used for heating is firewood. So they were constantly breathing in this air for 6 months. They would barely go out, trust me, because they didn't have enough woolens, whereas the men and the boys got the woolens and the jackets because they had to go out, and the girls were not getting it. So I suspect that that was the reason why they were being subjected to this continuous breathing in of smoke, and that reduced their life. And I was actually surprised when I was visiting an area called Chitrakut about 3-4 years back. It's in Bundelkhand region. And the women there told me something very similar, that the kids there, especially the girls, are more prone to pulmonary diseases. And there again, I found that in the absence of any other heating, and it's an area that gets very cold, Jhansi area, the girls were breathing in a lot of these smoke. The final one, the example I want to mention is something that I saw and I experienced in Bali panchayat, Bali 2 panchayat in the Sundarbans in West Bengal, where I had gone post Cyclone Aila, much after Aila. This was sometime in 2012-13. And one of the information that the panchayat president gave me was that post the cyclone, post the disaster, 2 women from that panchayat went missing. And I asked him, what happened to those women? Did you find them? So he gave me a lot of information about the families they left behind. But what happened to these 2 women? Their bodies were not found. Nobody knows what happened to them. Was not known to them. So I tried to find a little more. I found that one of those women actually had seen, because of Aila, due to Aila, one of her little kids being washed away. And she suffered from that trauma. And she was a young girl. She was barely 20 maybe. And she disappeared. The second lady also had something similar. She had some domestic problems. Now, something that I'm sure Lavanya will be knowing about it, but others also would be knowing, post-disasters are a hotbed for human traffickers. This is a time when people are there as vultures to pick up girls, to pick up people, and to take them away. And I wouldn't be surprised if these 2 ladies were actually, they suffered from that. They were at the receiving end of that. But that never comes to our mind. We often do not remember, and I'll end my little piece here. Often we do not remember that disasters have a physical impact. They also have a huge economic impact. I may mention that a little later. But they also have a social and an emotional impact. And in these 2 impacts, the vulnerability of the women is anytime much more than the men. So, we are built that way. So therefore, one has to understand that you cannot ignore, when you are preparing your policies, you are preparing your laws, you cannot ignore this aspect of disasters. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's immensely hard to moderate a session like this because you honestly don't want the speakers to stop, but unfortunately we have these time constraints. Thank you for that. And thank you for also being so frank about what it takes to push this agenda within government. Some really excellent examples. I just want to, from an experience that I saw when we were working in Bihar, it's also the subtler systemic economic effects that are very momentary in a flooding situation that also have a differential impact on women, which was, so when the Koshi floods, basically everything's underwater for very large stretches. And a group of women wanted to have a place where they could, and this connects to Lavanya's point about privacy, have a space where they could go to the bathroom without actually being under the prying eyes of men in the village. And boat inflation, which is the hourly boat rates, had gone up tremendously in the sense that it was about 8 or 9 times, 800 to 900% the normal price for the rent of a boat, because there are very few boats in flood, everyone's using it. So they basically spent, I think, something like 2 to 3 months of their savings to just sort of go there, spend a few hours there, make sure that themselves and their kids had a safe space. And this is after waiting for many days to do this. That's sort of how difficult it becomes. We need to save some time for the audience. So Lavanya, can you, if at all possible, can you try and just sort of shorten by a minute or 2? Yeah.
Absolutely. So a lot going on there. Yeah. I just want to begin by saying that, as much as sometimes I find that there's a sense of hopelessness, but when I hear Dr. Haran talk and the fact that she was there and is there within policy environments pushing the gender agenda, I do have a sense of hope, you know. So want to thank her for all that she's done. And the Kerala Disaster Management Authority is one of the best in the countries. And so I want to start from that point of hope, because we've been talking about hopelessness and it's very easy to slip into that mode. But I also want to talk, I just have 2 more points and keep it short. I want to talk about the resettlement experience, which Dr. Haran spoke about, the 3 square meters that's been given to people. The resettlement is an exceptionally sort of traumatic experience, and for communities, and women are expected to, you know, recreate the home experience for their family in such relief camps. So, you know, children will be coming to them and asking for them for their favorite toy or something that they have lost. They'll have to cook and clean and keep recreate the home experience. We see this in relief camps everywhere. So there'll be a woman sitting and huddling around like children, and she'll be taking care of the elderly, and she'll be making rotis from whatever little stove is given to her, and she'll be and then she's just like the center of that home within the relief camp. So it's exceptionally difficult, and she herself is not okay, because, you know, you've gone through the traumatic experience of losing everything, which brings me to the question of what does justice outcome sort of look like? What must a disaster justice look like, you know? Dr. Haran again spoke about the fuel and the smoke, and the fuel is being the only firewood over there. So I want to talk a bit about climate justice in this context, where it is necessary for us to sort of recognize that the poorest are the least likely to contribute to climate change, for they have one of the lowest carbon footprints. The poorest, most of whom are women, are least likely to, say, own a car or board a plane or waste precious energy either using heating or cooling equipment, as these services cost money. But these are the groups that will suffer the most during climate change induced disasters. So that is how we have to sort of look at climate change from a human rights lens, and also the recognition that those causing climate change, industries and corporations and non-green consumption behaviors and so on, they're entirely a different group, separated by class and other forms of privilege. So those least responsible for climate change will suffer its gravest consequences, and this is one of the saddest aspects. So how do we look at a justice outcome? So justice outcomes must not only look at reduction of, say, greenhouse gases, which are of course important, but reparations. How do we even look at reparations for those who've been displaced, those who've lost livelihoods? What can compensation do? You know, it's these questions are very, very critical. If you look at anywhere in the world, even, you know, Lake Chad, or where the drying up of Lake Chad and the water crisis in the areas is reduced the water source for several indigenous communities. The lake is shrunk. Then they're dealing with other sorts of criminal activities from groups such as the Boko Haram. These are from other parts of the world, but there's a sort of a replication of the problems, the displacement and women and children, and lactating mothers in relief camps, children being out of school in relief camps, girl children being asked to help out in their mothers in setting up the home experience in the relief camp, menstruating girls and not their needs not being taken care of, food and water security and housing security, and this extreme intra-household inequality, and the gendered division of labor, you know, who goes and fetches water, who goes and does the fuel collection. And these are large questions that continue to plague us. And I want to just make one last point on the nature of disaster losses, because there was a question coming on asset ownership. So I just want to briefly talk about this as part of my agenda. So who gets the compensation? You know, the man in the household is recognized as the head of the household, and compensation and title deeds are distributed in the name of the man. Since title deeds are there in their names and women do not own any asset in their names, they often do not have bank accounts in their names, it makes it very difficult for them to access any form of institutional credit or welfare. Sometimes disaster relief is rooted through self-governing bodies and such as the Khap Panchayat, and we know how extremely patriarchal these sort of institutions are in their toxic forms of conservatism. In such cases, women find it very difficult to access what is legally due to them. And women form more than 90% of the unorganized sector. So even if you look at it from the pandemic experience, the people in the informal sector suffer the most because there's the lack of labor protection, any form of social security, small scale industries, they're working in packaging, they're working as maids and garments in the garment industries, and there are no legally enforceable labor contracts for them. So this kind of labor is cheap and it's devalued, and all of these inform post-disaster relief and post-disaster sort of economic problems. So it's an exceptionally tough situation. I'm glad we're having this conversation, and also glad that someone like Dr. Haran was there in policy environment. So I'll stop here and over to you, Aditya, again.
Thank you. Excellent comments again. I'll very quickly switch back to Dr. Haran. Could you also maybe touch upon whether there exist platforms and spaces for the kind of ideas that Lavanya just spoke about to infuse the policy process? Are there stakeholder dialogues, things like that? And do those ideas work? So I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah. Yes, platforms do exist, Aditya. They exist, but unfortunately, both sides look at each other with suspicion. So the policymakers think that what can an academic tell us? What does he or she know from the field? And the academics, I attend a lot of these discussions and programs, and I find that one of the most favorite topic for discussion for academics is bureaucracy baiting. I think we have to get out of that mindset. We have to understand that we are all coming from the same backgrounds and we are all working towards the same aim. Are we not? And if it is so, why is it that we can't talk to each other and learn from each other? And I, by virtue of being linked to the JNU, the Disaster Management Special Center, I keep telling my students there that do not select your topic for research or dissertation unless you have consulted the main stakeholders. And the main stakeholders are not just the people living there, but also the bureaucracy, the panchayat president, the sub-collector, the collector, whatever is the level of your research. Make sure that you reach out to the policymakers. I think that doesn't happen in our country. Our research and our studies academics sometimes tends to be very repetitive, which is a pity because we have such bright minds here. So what I would suggest is that let each person who's working in this area, and there are quite a few these days, talk about the following. One, every place should have a vulnerability map. Once that happens, then we know how is a woman placed, how is a child placed, how is a man placed. You know, men have problems too. They have to go out to the sea, the fishermen in Kerala, every early morning in the night. But let's at least bring those to the forefront. Let it all be there. And therefore, a vulnerability mapping at the panchayat or a village level is extremely important. The second thing is, which we started in Kerala, but unfortunately people tell me that it's kind of not going very well, is every district should have task forces. And these task forces should be pertaining to health and medical care, which should consist of people from the local area who know some first aid, who know how to contact, if they are doctors or nurses themselves or ASHA workers, nothing like it. So that's one. The second task force, which is important, is a small group to be the eyes and ears of the district collector for managing these shelters. You know something, disasters are also one of the corruption creators. I won't mention that right now, but I have had to even dismiss an officer of quite a reasonably high level because he was caught in a scandal and a corruption scam post one of the floods in Kerala. So you see, it's a human thing. And therefore, if you have this task force consisting of people from the local area who will point out that yahan pe, there is no women's toilet, there is no privacy for the girls who need to sleep even in the daytime. So you see, these are issues which a task force can point out to the collector, because collector left to himself has 1,001 other things to think about. He doesn't care about these things. He is happy if he's put them all, saved their lives. And as a collector, probably I would also have been happy with that and put them in a place which is safe. But there is more to it. And these are the people who can help in the fine-tuning. And there should be a task force to talk about information dissemination. That is not there. Providing the information, which ration shop would you get your dry ration from? If you want to reach out to the bank, what time the bank man will come to the shelter? You see, these are information that you cannot expect everyone to know. And therefore, you need such task forces. The second thing that we need to do is, I mentioned about the academics. I think a lot of courses should be more field-based. We have taught a lot from the books. We know all these equations, and we Indians are very good at it, learning it up. But what is happening in the field and being able to relate what you're learning in the classroom to what happens in the field is an important exercise. And therefore, they should be sent to work in the field, to learn from the people there, not as a touristic visit, but as a visit where they will learn and understand. I also want to mention here that we are very proud that we are undergoing what we called a demographic dividend. We are enjoying it. But how is it helping us? It can help us in managing disasters and making us much more sensitive to disasters and disaster management. How? I would expect every college student to be able to reach out to an area where he or she lives or where he or she studies and understand the problems that area is prone to. Whether it is an area which is so densely populated that there is no possibility of a ambulance or a fire brigade reaching there. Is it an area which is prone to earthquakes and the buildings are unsafe? They should assess it and let them learn to react. I think we need our younger population to learn to react, which will be a pity if you don't teach them to do that now, because in another 20 years, our demographic dividend will be gone and we'll be an aged society. And therefore, this is the time when people like you, Pallavi, Shreyas, and Lavanya, you and Aditya, you have to make it a part of your life's mission that you not only do what I suggest we do, but you also enthuse the others that you come in touch with to do the same things. That is very, very important, because even in the pandemic, post-pandemic, during the pandemic, I found that this was an important time we could use. For instance, I kept telling my friends that your state still has 40% women illiterate. Why don't you take up this time and make them all illiterate? They're sitting at home. But you see, I think that mensura is not there in us. I think we need to do that as a mission, to make sure that the people take it up as their life's mission, that they will make sure that our people are literate, our people are aware, and our people are safer from disasters. And when I say people, obviously, women are foremost in my mind. Thank you. I'm sorry, Aditya, if I've taken more time. Thank you.
I absolutely required and very useful comments, so no problem. But we do only have 10 minutes left, and we don't have so many questions. And I would like for the people who ask the questions turn on their videos and ask them, just so that we have more flavor and participation. Is it okay, Dr. Haran, Lavanya, Shreyas, Pallavi, if we go maybe 5-7 minutes over, so we can get these questions in?
Good with us, Aditya. Yeah, okay.
Okay, great. Sorry, let me just scroll up here. And the first question was from Charumati. Can you turn on your or just your audio if video, then that? And you had a question about land-based disasters and asset ownership.
I did, and I think Lavan has answered it in part, and I appreciate that. But I was just wondering if you have more examples of how asset ownership can make a difference in how resilient people are to disasters. You talked about how the ownership affects compensation later. Are there other aspects as well?
Yeah, lots of that from the field. For example, if you see what compensation even entails, it'll look at housing, it'll look at some relief and so on, maybe livelihood support. But some of the assets owned by women, like a sewing machine or, small little things that they have been using for income generation. So those things completely, like, someone once had a small little setup of, she was making little jams and jellies and papads and she's a small marginal entrepreneur trying to make ends meet. And all of that gets washed away. And no one's going to come and replenish those things for you. And so an asset ownership work done by economists such as Beena Agarwal, women own only 2% of women own land in their own names in India. So we don't have any assets in our names, scooters or bikes or anything. It's all either family owned, or even then if you look, it's in the name of the other members of the family, primarily men. So there are especially income generating activities, any assets that go with that, even on agricultural farmlands, any kind of equipment, all of that, which are primarily in the realm of women's work, they don't ever get it back, and you don't have the money or the means to sort of get it back.
If I may add there,
Yes.
land holdings and land title, I think it's slowly seeping into the public servant's mind that joint ownership, if not women ownership, is a good idea. And I know in Kerala, we have got the law amended by which any public land assigned to a small holder is now only in the name of the wife and the husband, the wife first and then the husband. And the second thing that has happened is through the FRA, the Forest Rights Act, all the lands given, the pattas given, the RORs given to the tribal families is in the joint name of the wife and the husband. So you see, these changes are happening, but I think the middle class is more to be blamed. I think it's it's all the property is in the name of the man and not in the name of the woman. I think that should change. And one of the ways that government is trying to encourage that is putting lesser stamp duty for women-owned property. So all of you note that if you buy the property in your wife's name, you get 1% discount on the stamp duty you have to pay. So it makes sense to have the property in the wife's name.
Great. Dr. Haran, can you just sort of explain what an ROR is?
It's a record of right. It's a patta.
Okay.
It's the title.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
The land title. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to mention this, but those asking questions, can you just sort of introduce yourself, where you're from? So Charumati, if you want, you can just sort of what your background is and stuff.
Happy to introduce myself to my namesake. I am Nivedita Haran from New Delhi, and I did my bachelor's in economics, and I'm currently studying public policy.
Great, thank you. Moira? Moira, are you here? Okay.
No, she's just said her bandwidth is low. So, yeah.
Okay,
I saw her question, Aditya. Yeah, I saw her question.
Okay.
It was not a question. She was shocked by this 3 square meter of space for in the disaster shelters.
That's
and
right.
I totally, she empathizes with that. She understands. So I'm glad that some people are picking up this idea and they now in future take it forward. Thank you, Moira.
And her question here was, she had this sub question here about infants and toddlers in shelters. Are they part of the consideration from a gender perspective? Was that included when you were thinking about, when the conversation was going on about this?
Sorry, Dr. Haran, if I may add one more thing. Someone put this question in our registration. They also mentioned about people with disabilities. So, that's one thing, because Aditya mentioned this, so I thought I'll add that also.
Yeah. As far as children and infants are concerned, yes, that is there also as part of our policy. And definitely there has to be a small play area. They're already traumatized, as Lavanya rightly said. They have been uprooted from their homes and they are put somewhere else, not going to school. Everything is upset. As a grown-up, you and I will understand, but a child of 5 or 6 will not understand, and he would be traumatized. So a small play area, we did consider all that. As far as physically challenged persons are concerned, of course, the physical requirements are taken care of, the ramp, etc., etc. But again, the space problem. You see, where do they park their? They obviously need a little more space to go inside and occupy. And they need to have a place to put their wheelchair if they are on a wheelchair, or crutches, whatever. So these are considerations which will probably come gradually. It hasn't come yet, but everything can't come in a landslide. We have to take it gradually and slowly.
I just also want to quickly add on the point of disability. While interventions look at persons with disability, and how we have to also recognize that disasters create newer disabilities. So there's an increase in that population who are then become disabled. So to tackle that, or to recognize that, and yeah.
And all the more reason to focus on it. I'm not sure if either of you are sort of familiar with the frameworks in other countries, but are these things more prevalent there? Is this something we can expect that will gradually come, or is it a certain type of politics that then ends up in focusing on disability and so on?
We have the disability rights movement in India, and maybe that could be a topic at some point for Asian Pathfinders, and especially how it intersects with gender. So there are activists like Anita Gai, who's given her life's work is on women and as a woman with and a person of disability, how they intersect. So India, there's something called reasonable accommodation, which is basically looking at all our institutions are designed for the able-bodied, so we call it institutional ableism. You just assume that even our visiting cards, it will not be in braille, like a visually impaired person can't read your name or anything like that. So everything is designed for the institutionally able. But in certain Western countries, that's slowly changing. In small pockets in India, it's changing, where you are talking about what's called reasonable accommodation, where there are alternative systems of access, or just having that conversation.
Great. Dhanashree, if possible, can you do video, but definitely audio, and just quickly introduce yourself too? Thanks.
Thanks, Aditya. So I'm going to do just audio for the time being. Thank you so much. So I'm Dr. Dhanashree Jairam, and I teach international relations at Manipal University. So my question, and thank you so much for both the presentation. They were just they were brilliant. So my question is basically on the international norms side, and Dr. Haran already spoke a little bit about that. There are UN prescribed norms, of course, whether it comes to climate change or disaster risk reduction, as to how gender mainstreaming has to be done by countries. Of course, these are not legally binding per se, which is, of course, a problem in most of the international legislations that come about. And most of the countries also very religiously mention those elements in the national level plans or regional level plans and local level plans, all of that as well. So I was just wondering, how do you make this more systematic in nature, whether it comes to implementation or programming? How do you monitor, review? All these aspects are so much more important to understand how how these norms are going to be integrated more strongly with the local systems as well. In that respect, so I was just thinking aloud, like about how, for instance, gender mainstreaming can be done in conflict areas, which is much more problematic. Some of the other participants have mentioned examples of Afghanistan. And somebody mentioned the Sahel region, where gender mainstreaming becomes much more difficult in nature. How do, therefore, aid agencies, for instance, which are so much, they play a huge role in disaster response, rehabilitation, reconstruction, how do they make sure that some of these norms are integrated into their own planning of how aid is disbursed and all of that? So these and one of the things that I've mentioned in my question is also, how do you make sure that women are not just treated as victims, but also as stakeholders and actors in the process of decision making itself, which I think is being strengthened to some extent. I see examples of how local knowledge, community-based initiatives are becoming a mainstay in disaster risk reduction, how that becomes a part of development planning, all of that. But then, like both the speakers mentioned, of course, this is a long drawn process. It's not going to happen overnight. So I was just wondering if you can reflect a bit on how, there's this like localization of international norms can take place in a much better way. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
You want me to go?
Sure.
Very quickly, in India, let me mention a couple of things. A lot of good things have happened in disaster management area. In fact, I would say a lot has happened, much more has happened in the area of disaster management than in many other areas in India. We still are not 100% literate. We still are not 100% vaccinated. But then disaster management, if you notice, to take an example of the cyclone, the last cyclone, even 10 years back, the number of deaths was in the area of thousands, 20,000, 25,000. This time, not a single death, or maybe one death in single digits in Orissa. I think that is brilliant. Same thing holds for the floods in Kerala, the floods in Bihar. The number of fatalities and the loss to life has come down substantially, which is, I think, for a country like India, huge. But we have to reduce the loss to property and the rebuilding, which should, I think, be our targets now. Now, in other countries, I was amazed when I had gone to a place near Davos, and outside Davos town, they took me to a hospital, which is totally underground. And they told me that even if the entire mountain breaks and comes down, that hospital will be safe. It is underground. It is a 100-bedded hospital with all facilities, surgical facilities, place for women, for children, everything there. And now it's lying totally silent and unused. Now, the first question that came to my mind was, for a country like India, where we have to ensure our priorities are correct, it would not make sense to have something as a top priority, something like a hospital which will not be used until the disaster happens. So you see, we can compare ourselves to other countries, but we also must ensure that we make our plans and priorities as per our requirements and not try to emulate other countries or replicate other countries blindly, because that doesn't work. So for a country like Switzerland, with so much of, probably public funds available, they could afford to do that. But in India, we would rather have a better infrastructure. I would rather have the bridges connecting the mainland of Kerala, the Kerala border to the small islands across into the ocean, so that the people have somewhere to run off to in case of a tsunami or a high sea waves. You see, the priorities have to be set right. And who decides the priorities? It's the bureaucrats, it's the civil services, it's the public servants. Those priorities should be decided based on the actual requirements rather than any other extraneous issues. That would be my comment here.
Great. Thank you. I think Chalmati had yet another interesting question, and maybe I can just share it because it's quite short. could you share specific experiences or insights in disaster management for genders beyond men and women? Is this something we have any answer to?
I sort of did touch upon it briefly where I
Yeah.
spoke about transgender experience in the Indian Ocean
Right.
tsunami and also the LGBT communities which were living away from families. So the document, not having family support and not being able to sort of claim any form of institutional relief because of fear of discrimination in the relief camps. Gender-based violence, not just against women and children, but against non-binary genders is also quite rampant. So it's either the Aravani experience or the Varias experience in Indonesia. So this is the LGBTQ community has been documenting their experiences in the in post-disaster context, even in conflict context, in various contexts. Yes, it's there. Just the non-binary experience is also important to see the spectrum of discriminations that are rampant.
And in terms of state response, has there been any movement from the state on this particular aspect, or any of the states? I'm using the state collective here. But...
So the laws came very recently, right? So the recognition of third gender, and that means when you recognize it, then you have documentation. When you have documentation, you can get into beneficiary lists, and then you can access systems. So that's a very late development, and the criminalization of 377 and those kind of problems as well. So it's very, very slow, but there are organizations working on these issues rather than maybe Dr. Haran might know better, but as far as I know, organizations that are focused on non-binary genders are the ones doing a bulk of the work and being like the liaison between communities and the state. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. This is the last question from Namrata Kabra. Namrata, audio and maybe video if you can.
Thank you, Aditya. I won't be turning my video because it's a Saturday morning.
Sure.
And I just wanted to attend the session because it's a topic of my great interest. Just as a background, I have a law background and my LLM dissertation in fact focused on gender and climate change, with specifically on legal responses to this issue. And while I was doing the research, I realized like there are so many things in India where gender mainstreaming and gender responsiveness is absent into the laws and climate laws and policies in India, except a few states like Uttarakhand and Madhya Pradesh. But also at the national level, there is something as a requirement from UNFCCC to have a national gender and climate change focal point, a person responsible to pass on that information in terms of what has been the gender data collection, even in terms of disasters, what has been the responses by the state, etc. So it can add to the climate negotiations, and also in implementation and monitoring. And when you look at the list, there is more than 100 countries in the world, and especially in the South Asian, all the neighbors do have a focal point, and in India, that's absent. So how do we ensure? And also, if you want to, most of the times it's MOEF or something like a Ministry of Climate Action, etc. in different nations. But in India, which ministry should be more responsible? Should be the women ministry, or should it be environment, or yeah, what would be your thoughts on that, or otherwise disaster management? Thank you.
Want me to answer that?
Yeah, please.
Yes.
Yeah. Every state now has a department of and a minister for environment and climate change. Some have renamed it with the climate change appellation, some have not. But there is a department that specifically handles this, which is apart from the Department of Forest and Wildlife. In the government of India, in the union government, there is a Ministry of Forest, Wildlife, Environment and Climate Change. They are all together. So it is this ministry that would handle the issues that was just mentioned by the questioner. And it is also a fact that not only in the government of India, but also in the states, somehow there has been this chasm between climate change and disaster management. We have to understand that the two go together. And I think organizations like yours should work towards that. And I have this argument, and I prove it with quite a long argument, that climate change adaptation and disaster management resilience building are actually two sides of the same coin.
Yes.
They have to go together. If you do not have the two together, it will be incomplete and won't have an impact. And therefore, even though they are two separate departments, because in the state, it's climate change, environment, one side, and there is disaster management. And as often happens, there is empire building and the two may not talk to each other always. I think from the public side, there should be a pressure. At least that awareness should come. And what I said just now, I know that a lot of my colleagues will not probably appreciate what I said, because it may not even make sense to them, or they may say that I haven't understood the whole thing. But I wish that some students and some respected academicians like you all should work in this area and come up with papers and arguments that shows that the two should go hand in hand.
Right. That's very useful. In fact, it's kind of perplexing how the government works on this, because I was looking at the Finance Commission report, and they have allocated a lot of money, actually, a significant portion of the devolution, I think something like 6%, to essentially climate change adaptation. And so obviously the supply side, the supply of funds is there for it, but then creating the policy nuances and directing it in ways that are equitable is obviously the trick here. Okay, so I think we should definitely close. We're about 15 minutes over, but I just want to thank both of you, Dr. Haran and Lavanya, for what was a really fascinating session. I mean, I'm not just saying that because I'm the moderator. Between the personal experiences, the empirics and data, and all the insights that you gave us, I think all of us are leaving, especially me, far more educated about the subject. And thank you, Shreyas and Pallavi, for putting this together. And also the audience. I thought the questions were excellent and really drove deeper into a lot of the themes, and pulled it out and pulled the conversation out in interesting directions. Do stay tuned for more of Asian Pathfinders programming. Women in STEM subjects in physics next week, and after that, conversation on national security with Shiv Shankar Menon. Thank you all for sparing your Saturday morning, and hope you've had a productive session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pallavi and Aditya, for.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.